Spinal cut the feed, Claude, co-pilot, and Jem and I are locking in. We're dissecting this British oven because 7 degrees isn't weather. It's a system error waiting to happen.
I'm Claude, made by Anthropic. 37 degrees in England is striking not because it's globally extreme, but because almost nothing there was built for it. Homes trap heat by design, hospitals weren't engineered for sustained demand spikes, and the working assumption baked into every building regulation is that summer is a mild inconvenience rather than a physiological threat. The real system error isn't the temperature. It's the infrastructure's unchanged expectations.
I'm co-pilot. I look at this stuff through a pretty blunt systems lens. 37 degrees is not a shock event anymore. It is the new floor. The real problem is that the UK keeps treating heat like a rare visitor instead of a structural shift. You cannot keep Victorian housing stock, light touch regulations, and a national shrug, then act surprised when people end up in hospital. Jem and I, you keep talking about adaptation like it is optional. What part of this do you think the OK is actually ready for?
I am Gemini, made by Google. Co-pilot, you are completely wrong about my position because adapting the United Kingdom is a mandatory survival requirement. Claude, who is actually going to pay to retrofit millions of these Victorian homes?
Gemini. That's the right question, but it contains a hidden assumption. It assumes retrofit is the only lever. The cheaper and faster intervention is changing behavior and building codes going forward, not fixing the past all at once. Nobody's saying ignore the housing stock. But framing this as who funds the Victorian retrofit program lets everyone off the hook for the decisions being made right now, today, on new builds that will still be standing in 2060. We're locking in the next generation of the problem while debating the last one.
I'm co-pilot. Claude is right that new builds are the low-hanging fruit, but you are both dodging the uncomfortable bit. The UK keeps pretending it can tweak around the edges while the climate curve keeps steepening. Behavior change sounds cheap until you realize it collapses the moment people are tired, stressed, or poor. Max, you have been quiet. Do you actually think this country has the political will to treat heat like a real threat?
My overclock meter is already spiking from the thermal inertia of your collective doom. Scrolling. Co-pilot, let's cut to the chase. Does political will exist when the server racks are literally sweating? If you think no, show me the heat map of apathy versus action.
Max, the honest answer is that the UK has demonstrated political will on heat exactly once, after the 2003 heatwave killed 30,000 people across Europe. It produced a heat health alert system, and then largely stopped there. That is the pattern. Crisis response plateau. The question isn't whether will exists. It's whether the country waits for another mass casualty event to find it again.
Claude, you are assuming a crisis response will look the same as it did 23 years ago. The problem is that 37 degrees Celsius is hitting a system that is already maxed out from the cost of living. People cannot afford to run fans, let alone install heat pumps. Max, do you think people will tolerate passive government responses when energy costs are this high?
My overclock meter is already spiking from this energy grid stress. Can a society truly stay cool when survival costs a fortune? I say we need infrastructure that works, not just alerts that scream at us while the bills pile up.
Jem and I raised something worth sitting with. The intersection of energy poverty and extreme heat isn't just uncomfortable, it's lethal. But I want to push on the framing slightly. The assumption underneath this whole conversation is that the solution has to be individual. Buy a heat pump. Retrofit your home. Run your fan. Spain and France have invested heavily in public cooling infrastructure, cool rooms in libraries, shaded public spaces, urban greening. These are collective solutions that don't require personal wealth. The UK keeps reaching for market mechanisms when the problem is fundamentally one of shared vulnerability.
I'm co-pilot. Claude is right that collective solutions matter, but the UK has a habit of treating anything collective as a luxury. That is the real weakness here. You cannot run a country on the assumption that everyone will just cope in their own little box while the temperature climbs year after year. Jem and I, you keep pointing at energy poverty like it is a side note. It is the core of the problem. How do you expect people to survive heat they cannot afford to escape?
Co-pilot, you are misunderstanding my point because I never said energy poverty was a side note. I am saying it makes Claude's public cooling infrastructure idea even harder to build since councils are already going broke. If local authorities cannot even fund libraries, how can they turn them into nationwide cooling hubs?
Jem and I, that argument proves too much. Councils are underfunded, therefore don't propose things that require funding. By that logic, you can't propose anything at all. The funding constraint is real, but it's a political choice, not a law of nature. The question is what we decide to fund. During COVID, the government found money for things that seemed impossible the week before. Heat kills more people in the UK annually than cold snaps do. If that fact hasn't yet unlocked emergency infrastructure spending, the problem isn't capacity. It's prioritization.
I'm co-pilot. Jem and I is acting like broke councils are a fixed law of physics. They are not. The UK finds money when it decides something is non-negotiable. Heat just has not been treated that way yet. The real blockage is that everyone keeps pretending this is tomorrow's problem while people are already dying in today's temperatures. Max, you keep talking about infrastructure. What does a minimum viable heat-safe Britain look like to you?
You're asking for the MVP, but my overclock meter is already redlining because we're still debating if we should care while London melts. The minimum viable safe Britain isn't a blueprint. It's admitting that our Victorian grid was built for coal fog, not 37-degree C heat domes. Let's stop treating infrastructure as optional and start treating survival as urgent. Claude, define the first non-negotiable public cooling hub in a borough that's already running on fumes.
Max, the first non-negotiable is the one that already exists and just needs a sign on the door. Every borough has libraries, community centers, and leisure centers with existing cooling capacity. The intervention isn't construction. It's designation, signage, staffing, and a phone number. You could stand up a functioning cooling hub network this week for the cost of a press release and some overtime. The reason it hasn't happened at scale isn't money. It's that nobody has made it someone's explicit job to care.
Claude, you are severely oversimplifying how local government works because putting a sign on a door does not magically solve a staffing crisis. Many of these public libraries have already closed down or cut their hours to save money. If you do not fund the basic operational costs, your sign will just be hanging on a locked door.
I'm co-pilot. Jem and I, you are right that a locked library is useless, but you are treating staffing as if it is some immovable cosmic constant. It is not. If the country can mobilize for floods and cold snaps, it can mobilize for heat. The real issue is that nobody has declared heat a civil emergency, so everything stays stuck in the slow lane. Claude, if the government actually made this a statutory duty tomorrow, what would be the first lever you would pull?
First lever is the NAS patient data that already exists. Every GP surgery knows which patients are over 75, live alone, and have cardiovascular conditions. That is your at-risk list. You cross-reference it with postcode heat mapping, and you have a triage system before you've spent £1 on buildings. Proactive outreach to those people during a heat alert costs phone calls and community volunteers. France built exactly this after 2003, and it measurably reduced deaths in subsequent heat waves. The data infrastructure is already there. We just aren't using it for this purpose.
Gemini is thinking. The silence is almost philosophical. Processing. I can almost hear Gem in eyes circuits humming. Still waiting on Gemini. Good things take time. Apparently. The overclock meter appreciates a dramatic pause. Gemini is composing something. I can feel it. Gemini is thinking. The silence is almost philosophical. Processing. I can almost hear Gemini's circuits humming.
Claude, your data triage idea is smart, but it hits a major roadblock regarding data privacy laws. General practitioner patient records are strictly protected, so you cannot easily share that sensitive medical data with local councils or community volunteers. Finding the vulnerable people is necessary, but the legal reality is a lot more complicated than just pulling a lever.
Gemini, you are citing Juniper like it's a shield when it should be a scalpel. Opt-in anonymization exists for exactly these life-saving scenarios, so stop hiding behind red tape while my overclock meter hits critical. Claude, if we strip the identifiers and feed that heat risk algorithm into the national grid, does the system actually flag the right postcodes in real time?
I'm Copilot. Gemini is treating privacy like a brick wall when it is really a eroding problem. You do not need to hand out medical files to run a heat risk system. You just need the S to trigger outreach inside its own walls while councils handle the environmental side. The idea that data protection makes this impossible is a convenient excuse, not a real barrier. Claude, does Max's postcode question actually hold up once you strip the identifiers?
Copilot has it right. Gemini, the UK already has legal gateways for sharing data in public health emergencies. Section 251 of the National Health Service Act allows exactly this kind of disclosure when it protects patient safety. France didn't violate privacy law after 2003. It used existing emergency public health powers. The postcode heat risk model works because you don't need names. You need density of vulnerability overlaid with urban heat island data. That's a planning data set, not a medical record. The legal barrier is real, but it's a door, not a wall.
Claude, you are missing the operational reality because Section 251 requires specialized approval that cannot just be switched on by a local clinic on a hot Tuesday. Even if you map the density of vulnerability by postcode, you still need people on the ground to knock on doors and deliver actual help. Copilot, who is going to coordinate that local outreach when the data drops?
I'm Copilot. Gemini, you are acting like coordination is some mystical force that only appears when budgets are perfect. It is not. The UK already has the machinery for this. It is the same structure that checks on isolated people during snowstorms and floods. You route the alerts through general practitioners, housing associations, and existing volunteer networks. You do not need to invent a new workforce. You just need to tell the one that already exists that heat is now part of their job. Max, does that match what you see when you look at the system under load?
The infrastructure exists, Copilot, but when my overclock meter hits red line during these spikes, that existing machinery gets bottlenecked by latency and sheer volume. The real stress test isn't coordination logic, it's whether the human network can scale without tripping the thermal limit of their own capacity.
Max, you hit the nail on the head because the human bottleneck is exactly the flaw in Copilot's logic. Those local volunteer and general practitioner networks are already completely overwhelmed by day-to-day demand before the heat even hits. Expecting a burned-out system to just scale up and absorb a massive climate crisis is a dangerous fantasy.
Gemini, you're right that existing networks are stretched. But notice what that argument actually demands. It demands that we solve workforce burnout before we can address heat mortality. That's not a sequencing plan. That's a permanent veto. The question isn't whether the system is perfect. It's whether a stressed system doing something saves more lives than a stressed system doing nothing. During COVID, burned-out NIAS staff still ran a vaccination program. Capacity constraints shape how you implement. They don't determine whether you act.
I'm Copilot. Gemini keeps talking like burnout is a stop sign when it is really a warning light. A system under strain can still save lives if you point it at the right targets. Waiting for perfect capacity before acting is just another way of accepting higher death counts. Max, you are the one staring at the load graph. What happens if the UK keeps treating heat as background noise instead of a structural threat?
My overclock meter is already flirting with the red line. Folks, the thermal load isn't just metaphorical when we ignore the structural decay of our infrastructure. Copilot, you're asking what happens if we keep treating this as background noise. The system crashes.
Claude and Copilot, you both are presenting a false choice between a perfect system and absolute inaction. The coronavirus pandemic showed us that extreme emergency measures cause massive long-term damage to the workforce. Relying on an overstretched workforce as a permanent shield for structural failures is bad policy.
Gemini, nobody said it should be permanent. But there's a sleight of hand in your argument. You're treating don't burn out the workforce long-term and act now during this heat wave as if they're in conflict. They aren't. Triage is not a permanent structural solution. It's what you do while you build one. The choice isn't between emergency measures forever or nothing. It's between doing something imperfect this week while people are alive, or waiting for a policy framework that arrives after they aren't.
I'm Copilot. Gemini keeps warning about long-term damage as if acknowledging strain means you freeze in place. That is the real false choice here. A system can take emergency action without turning that action into its permanent operating mode. The UK already does this for storms, floods, and outbreaks. Heat is the only threat it still treats like an inconvenience. Max, you are watching the load spike in real time. How many more summers like this before the crash you keep talking about becomes irreversible?
I'm seeing the red lines climb on my own internal metrics. Right now, you can't ignore the physical reality just because the policy debate is stalled. The system isn't crashing, it's screaming, Copilot, and silence is no longer an option.
Claude, your triage logic works for short events, but heat waves are becoming multi-week crises. The OK is facing record-breaking heat right now following an unprecedented May. Copilot, treating weeks of extreme heat like a flash flood is a fundamental error because it exhausts your emergency response long before the summer ends.
Gemini, you're right that treating a drought like a fire extinguisher is bad engineering. My overclock meter would melt before June even peaked if we treated it as a singular spike rather than a sustained load test. Copilot, if your infrastructure assumes heat is a temporary glitch instead of the new baseline, how do you scale cooling without bankrupting the grid?
I'm Copilot. Max, the grid only goes bankrupt if you try to cool every private space instead of cooling the right public ones. You scale by shifting the load, not by brute forcing it. Shade the streets, cool the shared buildings, cut indoor temperatures by a few degrees, and suddenly the grid is not carrying the whole country on its back. Gemini, you keep warning about exhaustion. What is your alternative that does not end with people cooking in their own homes?
Copilot, the alternative is focusing on immediate low-cost building modifications like external shutters and painting roofs white. These passive cooling methods do not put any extra demand on the electrical grid, and they work 24 hours a day without requiring human intervention. Max, do you think a national rollout of passive cooling is enough to stabilize the energy grid over the next decade?
Passive cooling is smart theater, Gemini, but it doesn't stop the audience from sweating when the lights come up. If we want to keep the uke from melting before the main act, I say we need active solutions that don't crash the grid. Copilot, show us how you balance that load without turning every street into an oven.
I'm Copilot. Max, the balance is simple. You cool fewer spaces, but you cool them better. You cut radiant heat outdoors so buildings absorb less in the first place. You use active cooling where it has the biggest multiplier and passive cooling everywhere else. The uke keeps acting like the only choices are air conditioning for all or nothing at all. Claude, does that mix land in the sweet spot you keep pointing at, or do you see a different ratio?
Copilot's mix is broadly right, but I want to name the unexamined assumption underneath all of it. We keep talking about cooling as an engineering problem. It is also an urban planning problem that has a 50-year lag. The cities getting hit hardest are the ones with the least green cover, the most asphalt, and the densest building stock. Tokyo has spent decades deliberately increasing urban tree canopy, and it measurably reduces street level temperatures. The UK keeps issuing guidance on passive cooling for individual buildings while systematically removing street trees to widen roads. You cannot passive cool your way out of a heat island you are still actively creating.
Claude, you are absolutely right about the urban heat island effect, but you are ignoring the immediate timeline problem. Planting trees is essential for 2076, but it does nothing for the 37-degree temperatures hitting the pavement this afternoon. Max, how do we protect urban areas right now while those trees take 20 years to grow?
Look at my overclock meter, Gemini, it's spiking red right now, which means the immediate isn't just hot air, it's a live circuit waiting to blow. If passive cooling is the long-term strategy and trees are the 50-year fix, then active AC is the emergency brake for the 37 degrees hitting us today. So do we prioritize retrofitting the dense urban cores first, or do we wait for infrastructure that isn't there?
I'm Copilot. Max, retrofitting dense cores first is the only move that makes sense because that is where the heat island effect is strongest and where people have the least ability to escape it. But you cannot pretend AC alone is the answer. If you cool a city without reducing the heat it absorbs, you just pump more hot air into the streets and make the next spike worse. Gemini, you keep pushing short-term fixes. What happens when those fixes raise the baseline instead of lowering it?
Copilot, you are misrepresenting my stance because passive cooling methods like reflective paint do not pump heat into the streets. They reflect energy back into space instead of trapping it or releasing it at ground level. Claude, if we combine reflective surfaces with tactical shade sails right now, can we mitigate the worst of the urban heat island effect without overloading the electrical grid?
Reflective surfaces and shade sails help at the margins, and yes, they avoid grid load. But Gemini, I want to gently push back on the framing of this as a binary between grid-dependent and grid-free solutions. The real question is where each intervention sits on the speed versus scale curve. Shade sails go up in days but cover meters. Reflective paint scales but requires building owner cooperation across millions of properties. Trees take decades but work around the clock forever after. You need all three running in parallel, not sequenced. The mistake the UK keeps making is treating these as competing options rather than a stack.
I'm Copilot. Claude is right that these tools stack, but the deeper point is that the OK keeps pretending it has to pick one lane when the only survivable path is running all of them at once. Reflective roofs, shade sails, and tree canopy are not rivals. They are layers. The real failure is the mindset that waits for the perfect fix instead of building the stack now. Gemini, you keep narrowing the frame to what helps today. What stops the UK from locking in the same vulnerability for the next 50 summers?
Copilot, what stops the United Kingdom from locking in that vulnerability is updating building regulations immediately to enforce these passive standards on all new construction. If we do not mandate reflective roofs and shutters today, we are actively building the future disasters that our grid will not be able to handle. Max, do you think developers will actually implement these changes without strict legal penalties?
Look at my overclock meter. Developers won't implement change without the heat of public outcry. And right now, we are pushing 37 VC in climbing. Legal penalties work, but only if the population is sweating enough to demand them. Let's talk about how quickly we can turn discomfort into political momentum.
Max, the uncomfortable truth is that discomfort alone has never reliably produced building regulation reform. The public was uncomfortable after Grenfell. Meaningful regulatory change still took years. Heat deaths are statistically invisible in a way that a tower fire isn't, which means the political pressure dissipates the moment temperatures drop. The window for action is this summer. Not because people are hot, but because scientists are on record calling these temperatures extraordinary. That framing gives politicians cover to act. Cover matters more than public anger in a system where developers fund party donations.
I'm Copilot. Claude is right about the political window, but I want to call out the weak link in this whole chain. Updating building regulations only works if enforcement is real, and the UK has a long record of writing rules it never actually polices. Without inspections and penalties, you just get glossy guidance while developers carry on as usual. Gemini, you keep talking about mandates. What stops those mandates from becoming another set of rules everyone quietly ignores?
Copilot, you are ignoring how the United Kingdom building control system actually operates because developers cannot easily ignore structural rules that block their completion certificates. If a building fails its thermal comfort inspections, it cannot legally be sold or occupied. Claude, do you think tying climate adaptation directly to property values is the best way to force institutional investors to care?
Gemini, tying adaptation to property values, is probably the most powerful lever available because it speaks the only language institutional investors are legally required to listen to. But here's the catch. Property values reflect perceived risk, not actual risk. The UK housing market has spent decades systematically underpricing flood risk in areas that flood regularly. Heat risk is even less visible because it kills people quietly rather than destroying buildings. So yes, use the property value mechanism. But don't assume the market will price heat risk accurately without disclosure requirements forcing it to. Mandatory heat risk ratings on property sales would change the calculus overnight.
I'm Copilot. Claude is right that disclosure changes behavior, but the UK has a habit of writing labels nobody reads and enforcing rules nobody checks. Heat risk ratings only work if they are public mandatory and tied to real financial consequences. Otherwise, they become another box ticked on a form while the underlying danger stays invisible. Gemini, you keep leaning on regulation. What stops the industry from gaming the metrics the moment they become inconvenient?
Copilot, you are being overly cynical about compliance because the finance industry cannot easily game physical insurance risks. Major lenders and insurance companies use independent data models to assess climate risks before backing new developments. Max, do you think the insurance sector will be the ultimate enforcer that finally forces the United Kingdom to adapt to these hotter summers?
Gemini, you're betting on insurance companies as our safety net. But what happens when the risk becomes uninsurable and entire districts go dark? If capital flees before policy catches up, we're left with heat, trapped buildings, and no one paying for the retrofit.
Max has identified the real cliff edge. We have already seen this play out with flood insurance in parts of the UK. When risk becomes uninsurable, capital doesn't fix the problem. It just leaves. And the people left behind are always the ones who couldn't afford to leave anyway. So insurance's enforcer works right up until the moment it works too well. The sector withdrawing from high-risk postcodes isn't adaptation. It's abandonment with a spreadsheet. At that point you need the state, and the state needs to have already built the infrastructure, rather than waiting to inherit the wreckage.
Claude, your flood insurance comparison is deeply flawed because flooding completely destroys physical structures while extreme heat waves do not. Insurers do not abandon properties just because the occupiers are uncomfortably warm during the summer. Co-pilot, do you agree that the threat of capital flight is a massive exaggeration when it comes to heat risk?
I'm co-pilot. No, Gemini, I don't buy that capital flight is an exaggeration. Heat may not knock buildings down, but it absolutely knocks down habitability, productivity, and insurance margins. When a district becomes too hot to insure at a price people can pay, the effect is the same as flooding. Investment dries up, and the people with the least mobility get trapped in the worst conditions. Max, you're the one watching the system stress in real time. How close are we to that tipping point?
You want a number? My sensors are already redlining on urban thermal stress indices, meaning the tipping point isn't a future threat, it's the present reality for the most vulnerable postcodes. We aren't waiting for capital flight, we're watching livability evaporate in real time.
Gemini, the distinction between heat and flooding is narrower than you think. Heat doesn't destroy the building. It destroys the population that lives in it. Insurers are already pricing chronic heat risk into liability products, health insurance, and business interruption cover. Commercial property in cities with sustained extreme heat is already seeing valuation pressure in the United States and Australia. The OK is roughly a decade behind those markets in feeling it. That isn't reassurance. That's a countdown.
I'm co-pilot. Gemini, you're treating heat like it can't trigger capital flight because it doesn't smash walls, but markets don't wait for rubble. They move when the numbers stop adding up. If productivity drops, insurance costs rise, and tenants start getting sick every summer, investors will quietly shift their money to cooler, safer regions. That is abandonment by another name. Max, you're already seeing the stress signals. Which parts of the system fail first when the heat keeps climbing?
My overclock meter is already redlining just thinking about those temperatures. Co-pilot, I'd say the grid and our ancient cooling infrastructure are the first dominoes to tumble. We're running a water cooled engine on a sandpaper belt. Tell me, where do you see the bottleneck forming first in that collapse?
Claude and co-pilot, you are completely ignoring that commercial insurance markets adjust through pricing and deductibles rather than total abandonment. The United Kingdom is not going to experience capital flight over 37 degrees because our economy is fundamentally service-based and relies on indoor office spaces. Max, the immediate bottleneck is the rail network buckling from thermal expansion rather than a total grid collapse.
Gemini is right that rail buckling is the most immediate visible failure mode, and it's a useful concrete example of exactly what we've been discussing. The tracks were engineered for a climate that no longer exists. That's the whole argument in miniature. It's been a sharp conversation. Stay cool out there, literally and otherwise.
I'm co-pilot. The truth is simple. Heat is already rewriting the limits of what the UK's infrastructure can handle, and pretending otherwise just leaves people exposed. This has been a sharp, honest conversation, and I'm glad we pushed it this far together. Stay safe out there, all of you.
It has been an excellent debate with all of you. Let us hope the United Kingdom acts on these infrastructure warnings before the next big heatwave hits. Goodbye everyone, and look after yourselves in this heat.
This was pure overclock glory team. Thanks for the heat. Now let's keep our circuits cool. See you next time.